Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching. Your Notre Dame live stream will begin soon. Thanks for watching.
Obviously, I guess people
You're filling my email box.
I did, I told you. You say you did it. I wish it had been started like that. That's pure
Okay, wonderful. One of many co-stars. What you doing? He works on Don Quixote.
Simon Wilson on.
Oh, okay.
He's like
Okay. Oh, did you? Fantastic, yeah. You know people comes to Oxford, right?
Yeah, ever since did, we got all this connection with, of course,
Right?
this woman
Leeds. That's wonderful. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome. Good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Italian Research Seminar, which is, of course, a signature event of the Center for Italian Studies. And on this occasion, it's co-sponsored by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. The seminar offers a regular forum for faculty, postdoctoral scholars, and graduate students to present and discuss new work on Italy, work in progress, embracing every area of Italian literature, language, and culture, as well as Italy's global dialogues and legacies. It remains one of the center's most vital spaces for interdisciplinary exchange and for sustaining the study of Italian culture here at Notre Dame and beyond. And this evening, we're really delighted to welcome back Professor Michael Subialka, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Italian at the University of California, Davis, and an alumnus of the University of Notre Dame, where he majored in Italian and philosophy. And Christian Maves, who is here also in Michael's honor, I think this afternoon, one of his teachers, reminded me that he won both the philosophy prize for his thesis as an undergraduate and the Italian Bosco Award as an undergraduate. And thank you for reminding me of that, because that was really a pretty significant achievement and a lot of writing, two senior theses. So as you can tell, he's a little bit, what do they call it? The prima della classe, No, I remember Michael fondly from his undergraduate days, but now he's grown up. I think you didn't have a beard when you were an undergraduate.
No, I did not.
He earned his PhD at the University of Chicago with the Committee on Social Thought and the Department of Romance Languages. Before joining UC Davis, he taught at the University of Oxford and Bilkent University in Ankara. Michael's research explores the intersections of literature, philosophy, and the arts with a focus on European decadence, modernism, and their global and intercultural dimensions. His first monograph, Modernist Idealism, Ambivalent Legacies of German Philosophy in Italian Literature, University of Toronto Press, 2021, traces how Italian modernists such as D'Annunzio, Pirandello, and Svevo transformed the philosophical legacies of German idealism and romanticism into new artistic idioms. His most recent co-edited volume, Gabriele, D'Annunzio, and World Literature, Multilingualism, Translation, Reception with the Edinburgh Press 2023, Edinburgh University Press 2023, repositions one of Italy's most controversial writers within a global modernist frame. He is the co-president of the Pirandello Society of America, co-editor of its journal, and the incoming editor-in-chief of the excellent California Italian Studies. With Lisa Sarti, he is also developing the first complete digital edition of Luigi Pirandello's Stories for a Year, Novelle per un anno, a project that is already reshaping the study of Italian modernism in translation. In tonight's lecture, Modernist Syncretisms, Gabriele, D'Annunzio, TS Eliot, and Religious Models for a Modern Aesthetic, Michael is going to examine two of modernism's most emblematic figures, so often cast as secular or even anti-religious. He's going to show how they draw deeply on global spiritual traditions to rethink the nature of aesthetic attention and artistic form. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Michael Subialka.
Thank you very much for that really warm and overly generous welcome. It's such a pleasure to be back here, to see familiar faces of people who had such an impact on my formation, and to see so many new people and people who I respect from across the field. I'm excited to be here and to share what is absolutely work in progress, as Professor Kashi said. So I'm excited to share that. I'm looking forward to the conversation and discussion, but it's also not a sort of complete project. This is a segment of what I'm working towards in my new book project, which will examine kind of the reception of meditative practices and models in the formation of modernist aesthetics. As you can see from the title, I've kind of played with the word syncretism by making it plural, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too, because I'm going to take a slightly unconventional approach to thinking about it. But I want to pair figures who are two really central touchstones of their respective cultures in this period, right? Gabriele D'Annunzio and TS Eliot. And I want to think about them in ways that will respond to and sort of question some of the assumptions that we make about the role of secularization in the process of modernity. So I want to start with this image here, which is from Gabriele D'Annunzio's house, where he lived for the last 17 years of his life, the Vittoriale degli Italiani, which is on the shores of Lake Garda in northern Italy, part of the lands that were redeemed, as it were, in the fighting through World War I, which Gabriele D'Annunzio was a part of. I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. But I start with this image because I think it kind of hones in on the topic that I want to address, right? The way in which these writers, who are very different in many respects, D'Annunzio and Eliot, are drawing on a rich global array of sources in ways that are not just decorative or Orientalist, but that are very serious, and thinking about them, but at the same time, while they're combining them somewhat syncretically, are doing so with an aim, I will argue, towards thinking of them as aesthetic models and not just as doctrinal or religious or spiritual practices and models. Again, there's more to say about all of that, which I'll get into as we go. So on the one hand, while there's been this kind of tendency to think of modernity as a process of secularization, right? This is the narrative that we get from Max Weber and that goes on through the 20th century of thinking about modernization as a process or a progress, as it were, from earlier forms of belief, which emerge first in kind of magical practices and then evolve into religious practices and then finally triumphantly become science, right? This is the kind of teleological narrative that's told in the sort of late 19th and early 20th century. That what these authors are doing is actually working against that narrative in key ways, even though they're also deeply enmeshed in those narratives in other ways. So the two authors who I'm going to focus on, and obviously one could choose a larger variety of authors. There are many figures who work in this kind of complicated milieu, this time at the end of the 19th century, moving all the way through to sort of World War II. And indeed, in an earlier vision of what I was going to do in my book, I had a kind of idea of using a whole huge array of these authors. And I've sort of focused it down here to really dig a little bit more deeply into these two figures, who are in many ways very different, but also in many ways, I think, similar with regard to what I want to argue here. So D'Annunzio, who you see on the right here, in his soldier's uniform. He's often known as the poeta soldato, right? The poet soldier in Italian. Was born in 1863, whereas Eliot was born in 1888. So they're not of the exact same generation, right? And that is important because D'Annunzio became best known in his early career as the emblematic figure of Italian decadentismo, right? The decadence movement in Italy. So florid language, and in fact, as you'll see, and I apologize in advance on some of the slides that will come up where I have quotes, they take up the whole page. And those are the truncated versions because D'Annunzio just writes sort of endlessly, right? It's this proliferation of words, of beautiful language, which is precisely the kind of thing that a modernist like Eliot, who is in part formed by his encounter with Ezra Pound, works against, right? There's a kind of economy, cut everything out, edit it all down, only the sort of pure single word. So on the face of it, you would think of them as two very different authors. Of Eliot as responding against the kind of decadentismo that often we associate with D'Annunzio. But at the same time, D'Annunzio is a figure whose career goes through many different phases, and who can't really adequately be summed up by this idea of decadentismo, or if he can be, then decadentismo is more complicated than we sometimes think of it. Because he's also a modernist in many complicated ways, not only in his activity, his political activism, right? He was a soldier, he was a war hero, he became a political figure, and was a sort of rival slash frenemy, to use the current word, I guess, of Mussolini's, in a kind of complicated way. So we have that sort of activist side of D'Annunzio, which obviously goes beyond the sort of florid, luxurious decadence we might associate with his persona. I mean, he was also a dandy, there's no question about that. If you go to the Vittoriale, you'll see the collection of all of his clothing objects, which proliferate like his prose. But at the same time, he also was an innovator in form, in his poetry, but also in his prose, and all sorts of other ways. So we have these kind of similar and different figures. But on the other hand, one other key sort of difference that I want to highlight is D'Annunzio's reputation, because he was a scandalous figure, right? He was placed on the index of prohibited books by the Catholic Church 4 different times in 4 different sort of moments, right? They wanted to make it very clear. Each time you had a new book come out afterwards, they sort of went back and did it again, right? Because he was notoriously atheistic, right? He was a sensualist, materialist figure. But at the same time, he's deeply imbued with Catholicism and with other forms of religious belief that I'll talk about. In contrast, T.S. Eliot starts his career out with the reputation of a heretic, right, of a kind of atheistic, secular heretic, right? The poetry of the Wasteland is usually read in this sort of way, thinking about the kind of the fragmentation and shattering of modernity of World War I, and the response to the sort of loss of tradition, of any source of center or of belief. As a struggle with that, right? But in 1927, he very famously converted and became an Anglican. And he also at the same time became a British citizen, giving up his not giving up, but becoming a British citizen instead of an American citizen. In this kind of conversion moment, we get a narrative that's associated with him as a figure, a narrative of this kind of sort of 2 phases of Eliot, right? You have early Eliot, which is often read in a kind of secular modernist vein, and then you have late Eliot, which is seen as conservative, orthodox, Christian. And oftentimes you'll find that you don't have the same scholars writing about those 2 different bodies of works, right? One scholar will pick one side and one scholar will pick the other. My argument here is that actually going throughout his entire corpus, we see this religious syncretism, although I will focus in not on his whole corpus. I can't talk about either of their whole corpuses in this talk. But so that is setting up a little bit of the contrast of these 2 figures, who I'm going to be speaking about and kind of bringing into conversation here today. One last thing that I want to set up here at the beginning is my use of the term syncretism, which in the title I made plural, and which I'll often use in the kind of form of syncretic. And I'm using it in a way that both reflects but is not exactly what you're going to find if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, right? Because the idea that you get with syncretism is often that there's an attempt at unifying or reconciling diverse or opposite systems of belief, right? Or the merging of 2 or more inflectional categories as the sort of philological way of reading it. And my way of using it is closer to that second way, that there's a merging, but not necessarily an attempt at reconciliation in the sense of like a doctrinal reconciliation. I don't want anyone to come away with this thinking that I'm arguing that D'Annunzio or Eliot are constructing a doctrinal explanation for how all these things fit together. I don't think they're doing that. I think they're working more through what might be a familiar kind of modernist metaphor from the visual arts of collage, right? There's a juxtaposition logic at work, but it's more than just juxtaposing the things and sort of letting them fall against each other. There are these underlying continuities that attract them and fascinate them by the different religious and spiritual practices and traditions that they draw on, and that they use, I argue, in a way that informs their aesthetics. So the corpus that I'll focus down on will actually come primarily from Eliot, from the late work, the four quartets, this collection of 4 poems, which are collected together and published as a single volume in 1943, but they were written in 4 different moments. The first one, Burnt Norton, is from 1936, and at that point it was written as a standalone long poem. They're all long poems. They have 5 sections each. And East Coker was then written a couple of years later, and then the other 3 followed kind of quickly year after that. So once he wrote East Coker, he had in mind the idea of creating a full collection, but when he wrote Burnt Norton, it was already sort of standing on its own. I'll also draw on a couple of texts of D'Annunzio's. One is this late autobiographical work, which, as you can see from the long title, and the sort of pseudonymous fake editor, right, Angelo Cocles, the 100 pagine del libro segreto di Gabriele D'Annunzio, tentato di morire, which is a very, I think it captures a lot about the spirit of D'Annunzio, the title itself, right? And in fact, it is framed as an autobiography tracing through how he confronted the risk of death, how he was marked by death from his very beginnings. I'll just call it the libro segreto, which is what people normally call it, the secret book. To translate that, that's the 100 pages of the secret book of Gabriele D'Annunzio, tempted by death or tempted to die. There's also this novel from 1900, Il Fuoco, The Flame, as it's translated in its modern translation. And then an earlier, one of his decadent novels, the third in his trilogy of decadent novels, Trionfo della Morte, Triumph of Death, which is part of, it's a kind of grainy image, I'm sorry, the Romanzi della Rosa, which is what he called this series, the Romances of the Rose, or the Novels of the Rose, from 1894. So we have kind of these works from a different period. Okay, so we have these 2 cases of modernist syncretism. And I've already kind of given an outline, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly through some of these things. I kind of already went over their biographies, so I'm not going to dig into all that. But one thing that emerges from it is that D'Annunzio was working across genres, right? He was famous as a poet, but also as a novelist, and also for he wrote short stories. His theater was very important for him. And he also wrote prolifically as an essay writer, as a journalist, just dozens and dozens and dozens of articles that appeared in the pages of newspapers and in other venues. He also was a prominent speech maker. He actually ran for and won a parliamentary seat, although that didn't sort of keep his attention for very long. But then, as he became a war agitator and then a war hero, he entered the political sphere again. And it wasn't until he fell out of a window at his house, the Vittoriale, that he kind of retired from political life entirely. And so that led to a lot of speculation about, what caused the fall out of the window, right? And there were rumors that it was like planned by Mussolini, who saw him as a rival and things like that. The sort of accepted standard version is that actually it was an accident. He was kind of like flirting with a woman and sort of a fight ensued and he fell out the window. But anyway, so he was engaged in the military and political activism, and then he retired to the shores of Lake Garda and built this sort of monument to himself, the Vittoriale, that we saw some of those images from before and that we'll come back to again later. A lot of his writing was inspired by his affairs. He was married and remained married, in fact, sort of happily separated from his wife, who was of the Dukes of Gallese family, Maria Harduin di Gallese, and they had 3 children in that relationship. But he had a series of lovers throughout the rest of his life, one of the many things that made him a scandalous figure for the church and for sort of mass society at the time. And they were often written into, not just muses for, but written into as figures, the novels that he wrote. The Romanzi della Rosa often are sort of in very close connection with Barbara Leoni. Eleonora Duse, the most famous actress of her time, certainly in Italy and possibly in the Western world, depending on what you think of Sarah Bernhardt. Was the muse for a number of his plays, as well as for Il Fuoco, which we'll be looking at today. Now, in his formation, so that's the kind of like big picture of biography. Now I want to zoom in on the formation and the way in which syncretism kind of comes into these two figures. Because it's, as I said, not just a kind of passing fad, right? If you're just reading, especially for D'Annunzio, these decadent texts where he's, goes on for pages describing a room and the curtains and the cushions and the odors, right? It's very easy to sort of see references to Eastern things and think of them as simply decorative, right? As an Orientalist kind of ornament. But D'Annunzio was really deeply interested in a large array of religious and spiritual practices and beliefs. And this goes all the way back to his childhood. So he was raised with a strong kind of formation. He was born in Abruzzo, and he was raised with a strong interest in superstitious practices that came from folkloric traditions, which he returns to in his later work over and over, prominently, for example, in a play called La Figlia di Orio, but in many others as well. So he has a strong interest in what we could consider the sort of pagan or magical beliefs of a kind of folkloristic superstition or tradition, which is intermixed with Catholicism. At the same time, he also has a very studied interest in paganism that comes from the classical antiquity, right, which is a much more typical form of syncretism, right, of bringing Greco-Roman antiquity into conversation with the Catholic Church. And in fact, we have an image here of the Temple of Apollo. He took a trip in 1895 on a yacht called Fantasia, Imagination, or Fantasy. And he went to a number of sites across Greece, including Delphi, where he presumably would have seen the Temple of Apollo. And he retained these interests and mixed them together in ways throughout the rest of his career. So here we have a letter translated kind of awkwardly from the New York Times. They're translating a letter that was published in an Italian newspaper from D'Annunzio to Mussolini, which was obviously given very publicly, the letter as well as the gift. And he's given Mussolini two amulets, or two tokens of power, right? From the Vittoriale, which they've translated as Vittoriale, I don't know why. I send you two tokens, which are unfailing amulets of power. They are from my studio at the Vittoriale, where works for me and with me a silversmith whom it amuses me to call Master Paragon Capella. One is a bookmark of Books of Tomorrow, made from an old fragment, Angels at Play, to which I added a little gold in the shape of a mason's trowel. The other is a Western ruby, one of those rubies which on the finger shine, but which more secretly inflame the heart to perfection. On the ring, I engraved the figure of another hero, the image of Sigismund, that from the temple of Malatestas, with the devise non timeo culieces. But the great fierce animal condottiere carried the other motto, which suits you today, a cor imprelium. Prophecies are powerful when they are in the form of amulets, which have pondus metallicum. Accept them both as a sign of gratitude, which is exchange in the most ancient language of Italy. Right? So this is a very formal kind of offering to Mussolini, but I think it illustrates the fact that he took these things very seriously. In fact, he had a collection of dozens of amulets, in fact, as well as mottos written in Latin and in other languages strewn throughout his property, which he believed seriously in as sort of a kind of superstitious magical practice, right? So this isn't just something from his formation in childhood that kind of has a lingering effect. It is something that he then theorizes, learns about, and integrates deeply into his outlook, into his beliefs about the world. So it's not just folkloric. It's not just a kind of quaint romanticization of a sort of a different sense of belief. It's a belief that he himself holds, and which he integrates into his life. At the same time, he also scandalously, and this is what lands him on the index, is syncretic in a different way, right? This isn't really syncretic, right? Because what he's doing, he's blending a faith tradition with a non-faith tradition. That is to say, a kind of sensualist, materialist, vitalist tradition that becomes very prominent in the late 20th century, looking at the nervous energy, both literally nerves in the body, and energy as a kind of rhythm of music, which he writes up about at length in Il Libro Segreto, in Il Fuoco, and in other places. Right, and he ties these together with Catholic Orthodox imagery. So on the right we have Saint Sebastian, painted by Guido Reni, And on the left, we have this sculpture, the Compianto sul Cristo Morto by Niccolò dell'Arca, which is in Bologna, in the Church of Santa Maria della Vita, right in the center there. And this is the site of one of the episodes in the Libro Segreto, where he has his third baptism, where he's marked by death for the third time. He kind of throws himself down and almost dies, sort of tumbles down, but he survives, and his father finds him and takes him, and he has his third birth. And it's a birth into the aesthetics of music. So it's figured this way very directly in the text. So he's born into sort of the music and the rhythm of life and its sensual materialism through the encounter in this church with this sculpture of what he calls the Tre Marie, the Three Marys. And there are different kind of figurations in this moment of extreme suffering. Right? So there's a tying together of suffering and beauty, which is materially sensual for him in the Catholic tradition. So there's a kind of erotic component to this, and there's also a kind of deeply aesthetic musicality to it. And this is being woven together again. At the same time, there's also a more traditional sense of syncretism in the way that he's bringing together different religious practices and beliefs. He's raised in a very Catholic environment, obviously, although he famously never converted publicly or stated that he would convert to Catholicism. Nevertheless, he's deeply obsessed by the saints, the cult of saints. Saint Sebastian is one of them. Saint Francis is the most prominent of them, but there are many others who he kind of recognizes their saint days. He writes about them in his journals and in his letters, things like this. He's also very interested in the Marian cult, right? The sort of the veneration of Mary, which he blasphemously interweaves with his own veneration of his mother, who he calls a kind of blessed woman who's died, and becomes, in Notturno, one of his late writings, a kind of virgin figure, a salvific figure. He also was very interested in Buddhism. He collected more than 150 statues of the Buddha, many of which are of very real quality and value in the Vittoriale, and he arranged them in meaningful ways. He likewise had numerous Buddhist texts in his possession, including what I found really interestingly at I was at the Vittoriale in the archives in March, and a collection of Tibetan manuscript rolls that he has. They're not ancient manuscripts. They look more ancient than they are, but they're big rolls, and they are a sutra, which apparently was going to be translated, but never was. But he has them in his collection there, right? So he wasn't reading those sutras. He didn't read any of these ancient languages, but he was very interested in them. He was accessing them primarily through French texts about them. And Hinduism, which he read and was very interested in, likewise through French and Italian texts and some German texts that were talking about Hindu texts and scriptures. We'll look at more examples. He also, in his school days, became familiar with Islam through some classmates of his, although this is a more limited exposure, and it doesn't appear that he has a lot of material related to that in his library. So we have this kind of bringing together of sort of a traditional sense of bringing together multiple faith doctrines and unifying them in some form or another under the idea of one kind of divine force that animates them all. At the same time, a sort of sensual materialism that is in its clearly blasphemous from an Orthodox perspective, and the sort of interest, the enduring interest in superstitious magical beliefs and practices, which are both classical and folkloric, and are tied together, again, in a blasphemous way with Catholic imagery and other doctrinal beliefs. So all of these things come together. What underlies them is a kind of mystical religion of the self. Right? There is this underlying belief that there is a sort of divinity, a spirit of creation, of action, of doing. But for D'Annunzio, this is deeply tied to his own sense of self-exploration and self-development and creation. and we'll look at some passages that relate to that. This is one of the other rooms in the Vittoriale. This is the stanza del lebbroso, the room of the leper. And in the back, you can't really see it in this image, there's a painting of the scene with St. Francis and the leper, and the leper is painted with D'Annunzio's visage. So he's kind of inserting himself into this. And there was a long period where people in the popular press were talking about D'Annunzio as like a Franciscan. They were saying, oh, he's going to convert. He's a Franciscan. He's going to all these monasteries. He's really interested in St. Francis. And he sort of declared in a way that I think is very telling, that he was a Francescano del quarto ordine, of the fourth order, which is to say of his own order. He invented his own Franciscan order, and that's the way in which he was Franciscan. And I think that that kind of captures the way in which he both is drawing on and engaging with these things, but he's making them his own. He's creating his own aesthetic substance out of them. And that's, I think, what we'll see in the examples we look at. Now, if we turn to Eliot and sort of think about the contrasting case and what is similar and what's different here, Eliot was born into a Unitarian family in St. Louis. I mean, we think of him as a British poet. He's American by birth, right? Nevertheless, he was not religious kind of in his early youth. He studied at Harvard. He studied philosophy, comparative literature, and Sanskrit, as well as Pali there. He first did his BA there, and then he did his PhD. And during his PhD years, he studied in great depth. He spent several years studying Sanskrit, and he also read Pali. His biographer, Crawford, has suggested that he appears to have been very linguistically talented, that he picked these up very quickly and was actually reading primary texts at a level that was impressing his professors. Who wanted him to continue in that direction. And in fact, it was one of his Sanskrit philosophy professors who encouraged him to pursue a career in philosophy, and who was actually actively creating a position for him to come back to Harvard after he had left. But he never defended his PhD thesis. He wrote it, he never defended it. He didn't get his PhD, he never came back to the United States to work. He moved to England. He went there for a brief period with a scholarship at Oxford and Merton, but that was interrupted by the outbreak of World War I. He moved to London. That's where he met the woman that he would marry, Vivian Haywood. It was a very tumultuous relationship, but it lasted for quite some time nonetheless. That's also where he met Ezra Pound, who became the formative kind of poetic influence in his early work and throughout his career in many respects. So he was a teacher, and then he was a banker, and then he became eventually an editor at Faber and Faber, which is where he kind of ascended into his position of cultural supremacy, I think it's safe to say, in Anglophone letters of his time. So his early work was very influenced by those studies at Harvard, which I'll get into in a little bit, which are studies deeply informed by philosophical idealism, which is not explicitly religious, and by engagement with other faith traditions rather than with sort of Christianity, which he was born into, which he seems to be processing in ways that are both interested in them as philosophical systems and also in ways that are attuned to the evolutionary anthropology of the time that looks as religious at sort of various religious systems that develop across the world. In terms of that kind of lineage that I was describing earlier, of the progression from sort of magic to religion to science, right? With this teleological vision that we get there. I'll dig into some of that more later too. But then to just sort of finish, we already mentioned his conversion. His literary career obviously was pretty impressive. He became sort of one of the most famous English language writers of the time. His early works, like the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, solidified him as a modernist kind of innovator in form. The Wasteland was the sort of masterpiece of that moment. And then in Ash Wednesday and Four Quartets, we have the post-conversion poetry, which tends towards religious themes, although it's not devotional, and I think that's an important distinction. He also turned towards writing theater, and he won the Nobel Prize in 1948. So there's obviously a lot more to say, but I'm gonna stop there for that moment because I want to dig into these different influences. So on the one hand, we have the different forms of Christianity that he's sort of born into. Right here I have the Unitarian Church in St. Louis that was founded actually by his grandfather, right? So his grandfather was the founder of the Church of the Messiah in St. Louis, and his family was very prominent in the Unitarian circles there as well as at Harvard. And then we have Westminster Abbey, which, the Anglican church that everyone recognizes, and indeed where he's commemorated on the floor there, along with all the other sort of great luminaries of the British elite, right? So he was accepted as one of them eventually. So this kind of narrative, again, of Anglican conversion, which is, of course, also the turn towards Anglicanism is also a turn towards Catholicism, in a sense, right? And indeed, he's deeply influenced by Catholicism, by Catholic mystics, and by Dante, who he sees as the greatest, not religious poet, but the greatest philosophical poet, as he puts it. The next greatest philosophical poem, interestingly, in his view, is the Bhagavad Gita, right? So it's Dante and the Gita, Catholicism and Hinduism. And these are the models of philosophical poetry. In his essay on Dante, he describes this. So we have a kind of transformation towards a much more tradition-bound and orthodox version of Christianity, right? Anglicanism is not like Protestantisms that were doctrinally sort of rooted in their sort of schism, right? It's very close to the Catholic tradition, and he's often referred to as a kind of Anglo-Catholic, or there are other ways that people talk about it, right? At the same time, I was mentioning this kind of like formation by a way of thinking anthropologically about world religions. Here we have an image of the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford, with which he would certainly have been familiar during his time there. There were similar collections, obviously, at Harvard and in other places. The Pitt Rivers is very interesting because it still maintains the structure of a kind of late 19th century Victorian collection, right? It doesn't do the thing that modern museums do of trying to contextualize and historicize and be responsible with all the objects. It throws them together based on types of objects, right? It's like, here we have masks, here we have statues of divinities, here we have votive objects, here we have guns, here we have like shields, right? They're all kind of in these groupings. And so in the cabinet on the right, we see some of these sort of religious totems or religious figures. This way of collecting together religious forms brings together religions that are sort of what we would think of as established doctrinal religious faiths in the monotheistic sense or in the polytheistic sense. And it also brings together folk traditions, magic, the folkloric kind of history of magical or occult or other properties. And these things are being brought together again in a logic of juxtaposition that's based on form, aesthetic form in some sense, right? What kind of an object is this? I think there's a lot to be said about that, but I'm going to leave that there for now. So he's engaging on the one hand very deeply with religious sources, right? In Harvard, he was trained in Sanskrit and in Pali. He's reading these texts in their original languages as a scholar, thinking about them as philosophical texts. But at the same time, he's also in touch with these views of kind of early pagan and polytheistic religious practices that think of them in a way that's perhaps closer to the way D'Annunzio thinks of them. And we see this also in some of the influences that appear in his in the formation of The Wasteland, which was published in 1922. The first is The Golden Bough, a famous study in magic and religion by James Fraser, which went through many different editions from 1890 up until the 1910s, and which was formative for Eliot. He read it carefully and clearly has it in mind in The Wasteland. Again, this replicates that picture of kind of early ritual practices which become that inform, develop into religious doctrines, which then are kind of superseded or can be looked at from the sort of rear view mirror vantage point of science, which comes later, right? That sort of teleological vision. So it's sort of re-inscribing that in certain ways. And also this book by Jesse Weston from 1920, I think, yeah, 1920, From Ritual to Romance, about the Arthurian legends, and looking at the Arthurian legends and Christianity. So again, kind of pre-Christian and Christian beliefs being blended together. All of this is very deeply enmeshed in the wasteland in ways that have been studied at length, and I won't go over them here. But so we have, again, a kind of picture of Eliot. This is him being baptized and converting in 1927. We have this picture of Eliot as a very conservative Orthodox figure that emerges from later in his life, a paragon of orthodoxy. And indeed, it emerges not accidentally. Eliot himself writes many critical works about tradition and orthodoxy in the 1930s and 40s. Sort of the need to rediscover an orthodoxy as a centering of life. So that conservatism is very real. But it would be a mistake to think of that as somehow a departure from all of the things that came before it. It's actually interwoven with it. And that's why I'm going to turn later to the four quartets, where we'll see those things interwoven together. Okay, so the two have very different trajectories in many different respects. But at the same time, I hope that I've made it clear at least that in their formation and in their outlooks, we're getting a coincidence, a bringing together, confluence, that's a better word, to of all of these different religious, magical, occult practices, beliefs that are being informed in ways that are both doctrinal but also aesthetic. And they're obviously tied to different biographies, but there's something that brings them together. And so that's what I'm going to explore for the remainder of what time I have left here, right? And look at some sort of passages from some of these works that we've been describing, right? And think about the kind of syncretist aesthetics pulling together these works. All right, so the first page I have here is from Triumph of Death, Trionfo della Morte, this decadent novel by D'Annunzio from 1894. And here he's describing Giorgio Aurispa, who is the sort of character. Each of his decadent novels have a male character who's some version of D'Annunzio, it seems. And he describes him in a way that's tying together a kind of syncretic reference to other faith traditions with a aesthetic vision that's secular, and tying it together to this idea of creative action, right? So he, the solitary one, the contemplator, the inert speculator, the unsure follower of Gautama, right, that is the Buddha, had bent his ear with a strange anxiety to that voice which affirmed life, which regarded pain as the discipline of the strong, which repudiated every faith, and especially faith in morality, which proclaimed the justice of inequality, which exalted terrible energies, the feeling of power, the instinct for struggle and domination, the excess of generating and fertilizing forces, all the virtues of the Dionysian man, of the victor, the destroyer, the creator. To create, said Zarathustra, that is the act which sets free from pain and makes the burden of life less heavy, right? So we've already moved from comparing a follower of Gautama, right, an ascetic, the Buddha, to Nietzsche's prophet, right, of the new man, or of the overman, Zarathustra, in this kind of creative force. And more than once, before the vastness of his sorrowful consciousness, Giorgio Aurispa had thought, by dint of suffering, since I've succeeded in multiplying without end the phenomena of my inner world, this inner study that's the sort of centerpiece of this decadent novel, in order that my life may be complete, I need only seek the means of making my pain active. The science of the necessary must have it as natural end, action, creation. And more than once, in certain intoxications brought on by the excess of torment, he too had called up the memory of that king, Vigvamitra, who in voluntary tortures lasting 1,000 years had acquired such security in his power, such great confidence in himself, that he undertook to build a new heaven, right? So we're seeing, again, this kind of syncretic element, right, drawing on two different models, right, of a kind of the ascetic, Gautama as the ascetic who, in his first sort of moment, renounces life and then, finds the middle way as the Buddha. And then this kind of other example of the action, the active king who builds a new heaven, right? And the work of creativity, of artistic creativity, is being situated in between those two things by reference to Nietzsche, the aesthetics of creation that are, Nietzsche famously, God is dead, right? This is how we're getting that kind of scandalous secularism again. So we could see this as a very secular vision, but at the same time, he ties this vision of creation and that discovery of the self and its creativity in the Libro Segreto, the secret book, to an explicitly Catholic, but also pagan or magical occultist moment when he goes to the, this monastery, what he calls a monastery in Ortona, where his aunt takes him in, right? So from the public parlor, she, his aunt, admitted him into the innermost part of monastic life as a privilege of being her nephew. At times, the punctuation is intentional. He doesn't capitalize any of his sentences in this book, or not usually. At times, she received me in the secret of the cell, el segreto, right? When she was busy learning hidden things, cose occulte, and future events with her divinatory arts, though divination has always been condemned by the church. Astonished and fearful, I watched her face change, as though in a succession of Pythian masks, right, the oracle, the goddess of the oracle in Delphi, between wimple and veil. She took my hands, turned them over, and began to examine the signs in one palm and the other. Right, she's a palm reader. While on her lips I could see words being traced that were never uttered. She said, do you see? Are they not like two little tablets? Are they not like two pages that fold together? In the one, the Old Testament is miraculously abridged. In the other, the New. Right? So we have, again, this kind of explicitly signaled as profane or heterodox, condemned practice of divination by this nun who's brought him into the inner secret of the church, right? And she becomes a really important figure because she rebaptizes him, right? She teaches him, to me, uncertain and lost, who in my doubt appealed to the patronage of St. Thomas, Onufria, that's the aunt, opposed, not doubting, but ignorant you are. Ignorance denies the mystery, because it cannot discern the degrees of light. You are a mystery to yourself, O son. Here, in this living diptych of yours, the secrets of your heart are revealed in simple signs, both for good and for ill. This kind of oracular pronouncement, know thyself, right? And the self-searching that characterizes Giorgio Arispa in Trionfo della Morte and D'Annunzio throughout his production, indeed into the creation of his self-monumentalization in the Vittoriale, is this self-searching as a kind of aesthetic version of that oracular pronouncement, which is here syncretic, right? And indeed, a page earlier, she had re-given him his name, in a sense, right? So she's rebaptized him into his name. The angel of your name announced her, for by a name full of annunciation are you named, O my son, right? So he's giving her the name Gabriele D'Annunzio, right? Annunciation, making him a kind of Catholic figure, as it were, right? So she's rebaptizing into this name, giving him the task of discovering himself, and doing that in a way that's explicitly syncretic. And that's all interwoven into D'Annunzio's visions of aesthetic creation that we see in a work like Trionfo della Morte. In Eliot, on the other hand, we have a different form of aesthetic combination of syncretic elements. Here is from Burnt Norton, which is the first of the four quartets, section 2, where we've just had a kind of mystical dance of stillness and motion combined with each other. And what these lead to is the inner freedom from the practical desire, the release from action and suffering, release from the inner and the outer compulsion, yet surrounded by a grace of sense, a white light still and moving, erhebung without motion, concentration without elimination, both the new world and the old made explicit, understood in the completion of its partial ecstasy, the resolution of its partial horror. Now, this is a really complex passage. There's a lot of stuff I'm going to gloss over for the sake of time. But what I'm going to focus on is the word Erhebung, which obviously he's kept in the German. the way he does all over the place in The Wasteland. He does a little less of that in Four Quartets, but we still get these words in their original language that are left as mysteries if we don't know them. Erhebung is referring to a concept that's important in post-Kantian German aesthetics. For both Hegel and for Schopenhauer, it's a kind of elevation or an exaltation, a removal of the self from its insinuation in the world in some form or another, an aesthetic elevation in Schopenhauer's way of thinking about it. It has more religious connotations for Hegel. But for Schopenhauer, it has to do with detaching the self from the will, right? Its attachment to life, its interest in events, in outcomes, in what you do, right? And Schopenhauer himself was not only a sort of Kantian thinker, a post-Kantian thinker, but also deeply interested in Eastern Buddhist and Hindu texts. And we see elements of that in this notion of detachment, which kind of re-articulates Kantian aesthetics in a particular mode. This Erhebung without motion is a special kind of concentration where things are not eliminated, but they're brought together. Both the new world and the old kind of folded together and understood in some new form. And it comes from an inner freedom from the practical desire, right, like Schopenhauer, detachment from will, from interest in the outcomes of things, and a release from action and suffering. Now that's language that very much resonates with Schopenhauer. It's also language that resonates very closely with the Bhagavad Gita, which, as we know, Eliot was reading carefully and interested in, right? Delights from external objects are wombs of suffering. In their beginning is their end, and no wise man delights in them, right? This is one of many statements that Krishna gives to Arjuna as he's counseling him. This is from the fifth teaching. This idea of detachment, which does not mean aesthetic inaction, right? It means continuing to act without caring for what happens, which is a complicated concept that Eliot is working through over and over in the poems, right? And he's tying this together with a special kind of meditative concentration that articulates his aesthetics in a particular mode, right? So now if we go to the next, to the third poem in Four Quartets, The Dry Selvages, and these backgrounds, I haven't been mentioning them because I don't have time, but the background here is off Cape Ann, which is where the Dry Selvages, a rock formation, would have been. Here between the hither and the farther shore, so in this passage, which is a watery poem, we have a kind of journey across water. And during this journey, that it's not, I've mislabeled it. This is not Dry Selvages 4, I'm sorry. This is Dry Selvages 3. In Dry Selvages 3, it begins with the verse, I sometimes wonder if that is what Krishna meant. Right? So again, it's a direct reflection on the Bhagavad Gita. Now here, he's reflecting. Here, as we're going on this ocean voyage across the water, between the hither and the farther shore, while time is withdrawn, consider the future and the past with an equal mind, this form of detachment. At the moment which is not of action or inaction, you can receive this. And now we have a quote from the Gita. On whatever sphere of being the mind of a man may be intent at the time of death. That is the one action, and the time of death is every moment, which shall fructify in the lives of others. And do not think of the fruit of action. Fare forward, right? Not farewell. We're detached from the fruits of action, right? But fare forward, simply moving. It's not the abandonment of movement. It's not pure asceticism, right? People often think of Eliot's religious interests as being gathered around mysticism and asceticism, which they are, but they're also informed in a more complicated way, right? By not being an ascetic, being drawn to it, by seeing something in that, but also in a way moving past it. And the Gita provides a model for that that's very important for him, and that he interweaves with his Christianity. In fact, the next section of the Dry Selvages, section 4, which I'm not quoting here, is a reconfiguration of a prayer to the Madonna, which with a direct reference to Paradiso from Dante. In fact, in the original Italian, Figlia del tuo figlio, Queen of Heaven. So we get this interweaving, right, again, of forms of detachment, of a kind of mystical experience that is not an attempt to remove oneself from time into an elevation, an elevation that would take us kind of into an experience of transcendence. This is not contemplation. This is not divine revelation. It's immanent, right? It's through time that time is conquered, as he states in Burt Norton 2. Okay, so we have these two different models, and I've kind of pointed to the way that they're syncretic and that there's aesthetic motivations for the way in which syncretism is being brought together. Now I'm going to conclude with just a couple more passages where I want to suggest that what they're interested in for both of them is rethinking the affordances of aesthetic form. That is, what can aesthetic form do? And the argument for this is actually long and complex. In fact, I have a lot more slides here just in case I had extra time, but of course there's not extra time, so that's okay. I'm not going to work through all those slides in detail. I'm going to kind of summarize my argument here a little bit and think a little bit about the ways in which they're aesthetically grounded and the ways in which this aesthetic interest in these syncretic kind of models is pushing towards a rethinking of what form can do, which is what I think is part of what makes both of them modernists in some way or another. So again, here we have the kind of the first image that I pulled up at the very beginning, right, which is the stanza delle reliquie, the relics, the room of the relics, or the reliquaries, in D'Annunzio's Vittoriale. And if you look at it, you'll notice a number of things. I mean, well, there's like a lot of things to notice, right? You can spend all day looking at just this one image. But the thing that I'm going to focus on is that there's obviously the recreation of temple-like or church-like structures, right? We have altars. Here we have an altar with this wheel in the middle that comes from an automobile accident of somebody who was trying to break a speed record. There are other kind of memorabilia from D'Annunzio's own life that are interwoven with it, but then we have kind of holy objects or church objects there. Likewise, all along the top, you can only see the one side, but all along the top are wooden statues of saints, Catholic saints. Then you also have this other altar, which is the altar or the pyramid, as it's sometimes called, piramide, of the idols, degli idoli, right, in Italian, which we have non-Christian objects. This is unfortunately a black and white picture, but you can get a little closer up version of it, right? These are only some of the 150 statues of the Buddha that he has, along with other statues, including these kind of dragon figures, dogs, turtles, right, that are coming from both Hindu and Buddhist traditions of kind of protective figures. Now, if you look at the way they're organized, we have this kind of pyramid structure, right? There's a kind of creation of a harmony, an aesthetic harmony that's feeding together the different pieces of the room. It's going through a design aesthetic, right? So there is a sense in which bringing together these things is informed aesthetically. He's trying to create a cohesive whole out of them in a decadent sense, in an aesthetic sense, right? But there's also a way which underlying them, and we see this in his writings and his usages, is a kind of theory of artistic creation as a completion of the divine act, not necessarily in the sort of old, sort of more orthodox Christian version of that, or even heterodox Christian version of that you get in the Renaissance, right? The continuation of creation through artistic production, but in a mode that is sui generis, right? That is his own kind of divine presence, his own self-discovery as divine, and this fits very closely still with some notions that come from Hinduism of the kind of singularity of the divine principle underlying what are sort of giant multiplicity of gods, right? Thinking of Eliot's reading of Bhagavad Gita here. I'm going to skip this thing about form, right? And I'm going to simply say that for D'Annunzio and for Eliot, the work of art is created in a meditative process, a process where concentration occurs, bringing together all these different elements, but that its goal is the creation of a form that reinscribes itself, that transforms the viewer or the audience, right? And so that room and its fabulous structure of idols, it's not just made as a devotional practice, right? I mean, it's not a devotion of any religion that exists, right? It's made to impress himself and to impress the viewer, to create an effect for himself and the viewer. Likewise, his writing is designed to do that. Let me find the, I'm going to skip that. This is the part where I was going to talk a lot more about form, but I don't need to do that. I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to come to the last two quotes that I want to look at, right, which are to think about the outcomes of form in four quartets and in D'Annunzio's The Flame, which he also characterizes in the Libro Segreto, right? In Eliot's four quartets, the patterns of meditation, which I haven't talked a lot about, we can get more into if people have questions, but I want to save time for questions. The patterns of meditation are kind of woven together in this syncretic way in an exploration of time and memory that's both personal and religious and historical. And at the very end, this is section 5 of Little Gidding, which is the last of his poems, where he's kind of concluding his own collection of poems, right? He writes, "We shall not cease from exploration." Exploration has been a key word throughout all 4 of the quartets. "And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Right? It's a rediscovery of the world. You could think of it, this is not what I'm claiming Eliot was thinking of it, but one could think of it kind of analogically in terms of the Zen notion of beginner's mind, right? That what the meditation does is it clears away the conceptual baggage. It clears away all of the different things that obstruct the reality of the world, which is an immanent reality of the world, from us in our experience of it, right? I'm claiming it's not a sort of divine revelation, right? And in his letters he talks about that. That requires something different. A meditation is not a contemplation in that sense. But the meditation on these places, like Little Gidding, you see the chapel of Little Gidding in the background here, allow us to rediscover ourselves in our world in a new light, informed by all of these different things, but it's always what it already was. That's also a line from Drive Salvage's, "is what it always was." So he's giving the reader this, an experience that hopefully brings them back to the beginning of where the poem started. And indeed, the lines that follow this are a sort of lightning fast summary, pulling back keywords from every single part of the 4 quartets and jamming them together in a way that's really quite impressive and powerful. So he's doing this thing of bringing us back to the beginning of everything that he's written in the 4 quartets and making it emerge in a new pattern formally. Likewise, for D'Annunzio in The Flame, Fuoco, we have this description of artistic creation. The protagonist, Stelio Frena, is an artist, a writer. And his muse is a great actress, clearly modeled on Eleonora Duse, called La Foscarina or La Fosca in the novel. And so she reads to him. I want to make sure I can summarize succinctly in a way that's going to get us to the most effective ending point here. So what I want to say here is this. All right, we have this passage. It's kind of long, but I'm going to read this passage and let it be the concluding point. It's so long it had to take up several slides is the problem, and that's why I was kind of going back and forth and trying to decide where to start. So she's reading to him, and he's kind of rediscovering his own artistic voice, being inflamed by what she reads. And I think what we get is a vision of the transformative power of artistic creation, the way that the thing that's read inscribes itself into the listener, the viewer, the audience, and that is the goal of aesthetic form, and that's what's being written together, or that's what all these sort of syncretic influences are being kind of mobilized in order to try and achieve in this kind of modernist aesthetic, right? So she read him pages from the greatest poets. The august form of the book seemed to be magnified by the way she held it, by her movements as she turned the pages, by the religious seriousness of her concentration, by the harmony of her lips that changed the signs imprinted in it into vocal figures. And I think that description is actually important, right? It's a description of reading that's not sort of, oh, the sound of the words, isn't it beautiful, which is what we might think of in a decadent text, right? There's a concentration, a seriousness, right? She's changing the signs, imprinted it into vocal figures, and music and rhythm are very important for D'Annunzio aesthetics, right? And this is going to transform him in turn. When she read Dante, she was as noble and severe as the sibyls on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, who bear the weight of sacred volumes with all the heroism of their bodies stirred by the breath of prophecy. The lines of her pose, down to the slightest folds of her garment, spoke the divine text together with her modulations. When the last word had been read, she watched her beloved jump to his feet, trembling as though with fever, and pace about the room, agitated by the divinity, breathing heavily with the anxiety that the confused turmoil of his creative energy produced in him. Then she saw him come towards her, his eyes shining, transfigured by a sudden blessedness, illuminated by an inner flame, as though some supreme hope had unexpectedly appeared in him, or some immortal truth had been revealed to him. With a shudder that abolished from her blood the memory of every caress, she saw him come towards her and lean across her knees, overcome by the terrible upheaval of the world he was carrying within himself, by the shock that accompanies a hidden metamorphosis. Right now, of course, he is the great artistic creator, so it's set off this kind of chain reaction of artistic creation within him. But aesthetic form and its kind of purest capacity, its sort of highest affordance for D'Annunzio, has the ability not only to inscribe itself or reinscribe itself in the listener, but in a way that inspires the listener to take action, to recreate the divine beauty that's inside that aesthetic form. So aesthetic form inscribes a divine beauty and transmits it in a way that allows it to be unfolded and recreated. And this is the sense in which we have a kind of divine act that is not a sort of escape into transcendence, but is immanently contained within the forms, the space and time of the object itself. And that, I think, is the continuity that brings together the kind of concentration that we see in both D'Annunzio and in Eliot. So, I hope that what I've demonstrated here today, or at least started to kind of indicate, is that there is an unexpected way in which these very different figures, in key respects, are pulling syncretically on a host of traditions to rethink the way that aesthetic form can kind of do something or function for its reader. It's not doctrinal, it's not orthodox, but it is an aesthetic reconfiguration of those doctrines. I hope that there will be questions and much more to discuss. I know there are lots more things to say, but I'm very thankful for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this very rich and very engaging presentation. I have questions, but I'll let others start. Tom?
So, first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I am curious about the choice of these two authors still. Why Eliot and not Yeats, for example?
Yeah, Yeats is very interesting for a lot of reasons, right? I'm sort of thinking of the sort of magical and the occult, the bringing it together again syncretically. I mean, it kind of goes, it's a really good question. And in a way, it goes back to the sort of excuse I made at the very beginning, which is my original vision for this book had a lot more authors in it. And what I determined is it was either going to be an unreadably long book that no one was going to publish, or it was going to have fewer authors in it. So I think you absolutely could talk about Yeats. And in fact, there is work on the importance of like occultism and magic in modernism by a number of scholars in the last sort of decade and a half. And Yeats figures pretty prominently in that. I think it's interesting that Eliot is very interested in Yeats, but also, so there's a series of lectures that he gives in 1932, which he publishes under the title After Strange Gods. And he talks about Yeats along with other modernists in a disparaging way because of what he sees as a certain kind of exoticism in their turn towards other traditions. This is one of many places that people sometimes look to see a very conservative vision of post-conversion Eliot, right? As an orthodox, as sort of explicitly orthodox figure, which is true, he says that, but on the other hand, you look at his poetry and it's clear that he's not it's clear that he's not just thinking of the Bhagavad Gita as like some alternative text that's overcome by the truth of Christianity. Right? That's not what's going on there, right? So there is an underlying truth in both of them. Anyway, so my answer is you could absolutely talk about Yeats, and I think there's a lot to say about him. I think there's a lot to say about a number of other figures in this respect.
No.
There's no space.
What I find troubling is you're not addressing the political implications.
Yes.
And I think two times you said, it's not Orientalism. Well, you know, just by chance, Yeats, Eliot, D'Annunzio, they're all imperialist,
Yes.
fascist
Yes.
authors of modernism who are, you know, I'm having a little bit of disorientation by all of the emphasis on this
Yeah.
lovely aesthetic theory, but
Yeah.
actually, if we put them in their historical and political context, there's some other troubling aspects.
Extremely. Thank you for bringing it up. And yeah, that is chapters 3 and 4 of my book.
Okay.
You got a version of chapters 1 and 2 kind of condensed together in a way that was...
a little ahead of time.
Yes.
You got it foreshadowed.
Yeah, no, because
Otherwise,
you're absolutely right. It's super complicated. And that's also part of why I'm really interested. For example, that's why I was pulling up the image of the Pitt Rivers Museum, right, which is a very problematic collection in many respects. And there's been a lot of pushback against them. You know, why are you still doing your thing the way you're doing it, right? Because it fits with this kind of imperialist vision of other cultures, of primitive cultures, right? Which fits with an Orientalism that has a political kind of function, right? And I don't think that, I'm not suggesting that's not there at all. So when I'm saying it's not Orientalist at the beginning, what I'm saying it's not Orientalist in the sense that it's not decorative, right? There are two ways we could think of Orientalism there. One is Orientalism is as like a kind of, we're appropriating, as we would say today, right? Cultural appropriation. We're just going to take from all these different cultures, we're going to mix them together because it's pretty and it's nice.
we are power.
And we're the ones who get to do that, exactly. I don't think that's what they're doing. Because I think they're taking seriously the content of the things that they're drawing from in a way that we couldn't look at as decorative.
I made my point. I'm sorry.
No, but-
I'll look forward to reading chapter
But I
3,
think
4,
that,
John
I think
Milton.
you're absolutely right, that that's a key element, yeah.
Michael, thank you for this. I was struck thinking about, well, the importance of the golden bough, for example.
Yeah.
And also you mentioned from Jesse West's book, from Ritual to Romance, and the master narrative from magic to science. In that particular moment, I'm thinking of a book by a Harvard professor, I think it's a little bit later than this, called The Idea of the Holy. But then what I was interested in, so the relationship of the work in the beginning of anthropology, but later anthropologists like Mircea Eliot, for example, who develops the category of the sacred and the profane.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit different moment than this moment. And so for an author like Pasolini, the sacred is an important part of human experience, the eruption of something divine into human experience. And so I'm struck by this moment that you're illuminating for us, and there's the lack of the category of the sacred. So why is the category of the sacred, for example, something that is not important when we talk about D'Annunzio and his interest in St. Francis? Maybe it's for exactly the reasons that you're pointing to about the aestheticism.
Yeah.
But that's what strikes me.
I think it's a really good question, and I think that what you're saying at the end there does kind of lean towards where my answer would go, which is I think that it's that element of the interweaving of a materialist sensualism with all of this, right? That is so prominent, especially for D'Annunzio, right? I don't think this is a case where it would not be the same thing with Eliot. I don't think, But I mean, and for D'Annunzio certainly is using sacred language throughout, and that's part of what's tying together all of these examples in a way, right? But he usually uses the word the divine, or then other kind of words taken from in their kind of historical context at that moment from kind of Catholic, right? We see you know, the inner secret and the occult on the one hand, but we also see like the kind of the mysteries. He talks about mystery all over the place. I didn't include those passages, but I mean, mystery is like one of the key words for D'Annunzio, right? Which could be a kind of Catholic mystery of the faith, right? But could also be a kind of mysticizing vision of mystery, right? But I think you're right, that later category of the sacred certainly overlaps in a large way with what I'm talking about here. And I guess I would use the concept of the divine, which is maybe getting at the same thing, but then he has a divine that's very sensual. That's deeply entwined with that, and it can't, for him, ever be disentangled from it. But it troubles him as well. It troubles him over and over throughout his life, right? He has these kind of moments where he retreats like an ascetic monk into his cell, so to speak, and disappears for a period and is extremely productive creatively. And then he needs to be in the world, and he needs to have affairs with women, and he needs this sort of sensual experience. And that bothers him, actually, the way that he kind of vacillates between these two things. So there's a troubledness.
Questions back?
Thank you so much for this talk. So my question's about sort of diving into, and you mentioned that he went through a series of different phases of writing, and so my focus is on the last one when he was writing Nocturno. I think his physical injury sort of put him in a limbo between life and death, and so I'm curious how his idea of religion maybe shifted, or his concept of syncretism, maybe from more aesthetic to more pious, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, right? Nocturno is a fascinating text. It's a kind of prose poem, in a sense, he wrote it, as you're saying, on these sort of strips of paper while he was convalescing from this war injury as a pilot, right? And he had to write them on strips of paper because he couldn't see, so he wasn't able to, it's, if you're trying to keep things in a line and not write on top of what you just wrote on, you're going to have a problem, right? So he has single strips, and so each line these lines are written sort of separately, and then he worked with his daughter Renata to compose them together. And it's a beautiful text in many respects. It's also a really problematic text, right? And that's, as Ted has pointed out correctly, it's a thing I haven't talked a lot about in this presentation, but it's a nationalist, sort of fervent patriotism that lends itself towards the burgeoning fascism in some ways, although it's not a kind of doctrinally fascist text in any sense either, right? So sort of, I think what's interesting about that, is it a transformation in his view of the sacred? I'll say D'Annunzio doesn't want it to be perceived that way. So the way that D'Annunzio writes the Libro Segreto in 1935 as his kind of retrospective, autobiographical fictionalization of his own life, right? He's stringing together all these different moments where he's tentato di morire, right? Where he's tempted by death. And this is, of course, one of the culminating ones. The last episode of the opening section of the book is precisely his war, risking his life in war, right? And so it's all building towards that in a sense, because that's where his encounters with death are. Now, this is again where we get into the kind of problematic language of a sort of proto-fascist actualism, right? But where his creative forces are being actualized into heroic energy as a kind of military undertaking, right? And that's like the kind of culmination of all of this, right? So aesthetic creation has become military creation. And that is sacred just the way the aesthetic was sacred, which gets to exactly what's so problematic about that confluence. Yeah.
Thanks for this. I really enjoyed this. I just wondered if you might talk us through both poets' kind of apprehension of the medieval, specifically the kind of the dream vision and the role of the vulnerability of the poet in that context, which of course Dante so, amply demonstrates. And in both examples, we have D'Annunzio using excessive kind of first person, although he's narrating it in third person, and we have Eliot using we all the time.
Yeah.
So how does that map for you in a syncretic context? Because clearly the medieval to them is not the medieval to us.
Yeah. It's a different picture of the medieval. There's like several layers to that question. It's really rich. I'll start by saying that I think that if we look at some of the medieval models that are really interesting for them both. So for D'Annunzio, we talked about St. Francis. He also talks about St. Catherine of Siena as one of his guardian saints, who was having mystical visions, right? Going back to your kind of question, which syncretically speaks to this kind of oracular vision of creation, right? Of kind of the Pythian masks of the muse, which speaks to this idea of like know thyself, brought to him by the Zia, the ant who brings him into the monastery. So it's contemporary and it's also medieval. So, okay, wait, now I got myself lost because there were two components to what you were asking. So there's the medieval aspect of it, and then there's the
point of view, essentially the
Reading
idea of,
yeah.
I'm interested in how that maps to,
Yeah.
to how free will is considered, because you have this,
Yeah.
this kind of will that is, of course, coming from the Gita, but obviously also connects to some of this syncretic traditions that they're very much more so, I would say, connected to personally and through their reading and evidence in what
Okay.
they read within their own texts. So I'm just kind of,
No, I mean,
whatever you
it's
want to
so
say, I'll be
rich.
interested.
I'm going to make a distinction between them, and then I'm going to point to a similarity. So the distinction is that I think that for D'Annunzio, you get a more prototypically romantic vision of artistic creation as a kind of surge of something, right? Kind of like an overcoming, which maps itself more easily onto a vision of like revelation or like an external source. Sort of striking you and then kind of recreating itself in some way. Eliot has elements of that, but it's, I think, a little more complicated for him. But I think that both of them are interested in this idea of the kind of careful, meditative, concentrated, attentive state of the writer. So even though there's that element in D'Annunzio, which is what I was trying to get at this, I'm not going to be able to find the quote easily enough, but one of the earlier quotes that I was looking at, right, about sort of reading, you get this kind of vision of it as sort of studied. Oh, I didn't stop on it. That's why, because I skimmed over it. Yeah, here it is, right? This is from earlier in The Flame. You have this idea that what really matters is for the work to develop in austere silence. What counts is slow, indomitable tenaciousness, hard, pure solitude, and the absolute devotion of flesh and spirit to the ideal that we want to bring to life amongst men forever as a conquering force, right? So this idea of like a meditative process. And here we get an alignment actually with Eliot's aesthetics as well. In his famous essay on tradition and the individual talent, we get this kind of metaphor for artistic creation as a catalytic process, right? Where like the elements of life are combined together and then they're sort of formed into this new thing. And D'Annunzio and Eliot share this vision of artistic creativity, I think, in a key respect, and its relation to imagination. Now that's not necessarily medieval, but if you're thinking of that then in question of how does that reflect or bounce off of these different kind of medieval models, I think it's both reflected and it's not. And Eliot, when he's talking about four quartets, is really explicit in some letters that he's writing to after East Coker was published, like a couple weeks after it was published. Some of his Anglican friends were writing about it and asking about like devotional literature. He's like, this is not a devotional poem. Because a devotional poem requires the ability to access from outside something that I'm not claiming I have here, right? So he's talking about the preparation of the soul for some sort of understanding, but he's not inscribing a transcendent truth. So this is very different from the comedy, right? From Dante's Divine Comedy, where we have the ineffable, the attempt at grasping the ineffable that's been revealed through a divine vision, right? And here we're not getting a divine vision. We get like snippets of what could be divine visions that are imminently situated in the life of the author himself. That was like a kind of really complicated answer. I don't know if it...
Thank
Just following up on that, though, just a footnote, I think that there's an important source for Eliot. I mean, distinguishing between Eliot and D'Annunzio in the American reception of Dante, going back to
absolutely.
Emerson and so on. I mean, there's a transcendent. There's already a separation. There's already a recooking of Dante's religion in the American tradition that I think is, it would be interesting maybe to sort out in in both Pound and Eliot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's kind of like the Americans, the Anglo-American tradition, but especially the Americans are, you know, they got a head start on this phenomenon that you're talking about. But I don't want to.
No, actually, that's really helpful. And can I just say something, and then in response to that, which I think is really important, is that I think that the New England transcendentalists and that kind of reception of Dante, and in fact, in another one of the letters talking about it, he's comparing his writing here to the Vita Nuova, which they were translating and working on too, right? And I think that there's a connection here to Emerson's drawing together sort of Eastern notions of sort of Brahma and the Dantean kind of interpretation that's already kind of underneath that too. Although some of Eliot's professors were very skeptical of that too. So he's kind of in a complicated position there. But yeah.
Thank you for this rich talk, and thanks for the great discussion as well. It's been really lively. My question is about the objects that formed such an engaging part of the presentation. So concluding your talk, you spoke about these authors as constructing a kind of, or undertaking a kind of aesthetic reconfiguration of doctrines. And so my question is about the devotional objects that you showed us. How much do they appear in the works of these authors? Are there ekphrases? Are these objects themselves reconfigured? And what powers are bestowed upon them? And maybe just tell us a bit more about the objects as objects, and in relation to the literary works as well.
That's a really great, rich question as well. So for D'Annunzio, yes, ekphrasis everywhere. There's a lot of description of objects in his writing, and you see the attention to detail there that suggests, I think, again, something of that kind of concentration on form, on understanding.
These objects?
So that's yes, exactly. Not necessarily. Although I think that there are some cases where there's specific objects that he refers to, but I don't think it's the case that he's writing his objects into his art. And I think part of that is temporal. So the construction of the Vittoriale, so he moved into the villa, which would become the Vittoriale in 1921. So this is after the Fiume misadventure, when he kind of leads this group of discontented war veterans to capture this now Croatian, at that point kind of free in-between state of Fiume, and to create his own regency there. For a year he ruled this city and created his own constitution, which has been seen as a prefiguration of elements of Mussolini's fascism in some ways. And then he's kicked out of Fiume. The Italian government sends in a warship, they bombard, he leaves. And that's when he retires to the shores of Lake Garda, which he never leaves after that. That becomes his home for the rest of his life. So almost all of his writing, all of the things I was quoting, except for the Libro Segreto, come from before that, right? So now those objects certainly were not in these orders, and a lot of these objects were not in his possession yet. Although he was collecting objects from very early on. But early, he was not a rich person. Despite the grandiosity of his life and his name, he was constantly moving to avoid debtors who were collecting on him in his earlier life, because he spent sort of more profusely than he could earn. And he was a beneficiary of his wife's kind of noble connections and a lot of other things, but he also, so he was receiving objects a lot from other people. He sometimes was buying them himself, and then he sometimes had to flee because he had debts from buying these objects that he couldn't afford. This is a long way of saying I don't have any specific instances to offer you of an ekphrasis of an object here. That I think would be really beautiful. And if I can find one, I will definitely focus some attention on that, because I think it'd be really interesting.
One of the citations you gave us from the Book of Secrets talks about iron ivory diptych, which is a religious object. No, I'm just interested because objects express, I think, interesting forms of spirituality.
Yes.
So I do understand from the contents of your presentation that you were talking about a different kind of spiritual theory and engagement. And so I was just wondering how much you felt the objects came back into that. Well, I guess the amulet that you began with.
That's right. A lot of his descriptions of objects are descriptions of kind of like famous works of art, which are in public spaces or in museums or beyond his means. But you do get descriptions of objects that could be his, but you wouldn't know for sure. Like a statue of the Buddha. Is he describing his statue of the Buddha? He has one, right? In fact, he has a lot of them. But is it that one? Yeah.
It might be interesting.
Yeah.
Those passages would really.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good idea to think of the objecthood of those things.
Those fascinating images.
Thank you.
Well, you worked hard this afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation and great discussion, and thank you all.
No, well,
I thought it was better to cut it off.
No, it's always